Good evening, audience. Very excited to have the esteemed colleagues with me, and even more excited to have the topic. OTT, which 5 years back was a disruption in itself. I think the topic that we have today is actually disruption within OTT, the new alliances versus the conventional, traditional channels that we have explored. Gourav, let me start with you. You have been at the forefront of trying out new partnerships in India, starting with Ola, which is a ride-sharing platform, trying public transportation, Microsoft, and so on and so forth. Share us your growth story in India, and how are the new alliances actually helping you in that growth story now?
Sure. So I think the dominant consumption of VOOT is on traditional platforms. It's on VOOT, it's on telcos, MSPs, where we distribute. And those are where you see most of your eyeballs. I think the thinking to go beyond the traditional models of distribution is really led by a couple of things. One, as you can see in the West, I think it's becoming, it's a fight for attention, really, right? OTT, television, they've largely topped out. And so if you have a new service that comes in, you're not able to just grow. You have to take market share from someone else. Now, we're not there as yet in India, but we will get there. So at some level, doing some of these alliances and learning from them is about playing before the ball gets there. So that's kind of the philosophy. And the larger philosophy, I think, for a content provider is that if you want to get celebrated as a brand and as an entity that builds great content, it shouldn't get restricted to certain channels. And so the belief system is that we would like to have it anywhere that a consumer would like to see us, and we'll keep pushing the envelope on that. So that's kind of the thinking, really. From a challenges perspective, obviously that requires us to have a somewhat more open platform. Our tech stack has to evolve a little bit, keeps our engineers busy, but it's a great journey.
Interesting. Michael, on to you. I mean, you moved from LA, working with Amazon Studios, creating content there, to Jakarta, creating content for Gojek, which itself is a very new channel for distribution, right? So talk about the difference in content that you created when you were in Amazon versus the content when you create for very, very niche channels like the ones that you have in Gojek.
Well, I think rather than talk about Amazon, I'll talk about exactly what we're doing at Gojek. So Gojek, started off as a rideshare company and has rapidly expanded to include multiple services. Both payments, food delivery, and many, many others. And the goal of Gojek is to reduce the friction in people's daily lives. And so to try to make days a little easier by providing services that enable them to get tasks done quickly. And so one of the things we've done by launching GoPlay is we're really focused on giving a voice, an additional distribution channel and voice to Indonesian creators. Right now, Indonesia has about 1,600 movie screens. That's compared to China has 60,000, the US has 40,000, and yet has a population of 265 million. And so because of that, there's not as much of an opportunity for work to be seen. And we're hoping by offering NetSwap platform, we will enable that to happen for creators.
And what about India, Gourav? Like, when you look at your channels and consumers, do you see content being very different for different channels, or do you create one content that fits all? And also talk about a little bit about the consumers that come through these channels. Are they different? Are there different trends that you see across these channels?
Sure. I think the reason we invest in these channels is to understand consumer behavior, right? I think it's early for monetization, but it's interesting to see the kinds of things that people will view in a ride-sharing app versus on their phone versus on their television set at home. And so the behavior drives kind of what we send them. So our recommendation algorithms will throw up snacky content, fast content. What I'd really like to be able to do, let's say with an Ola, is if I know how long the ride's going to be, I should be recommending content just as much as that ride is going to take. We're not there yet, but who's to say that's not exactly the right fit for the consumer? And the beauty is as a content owner, you can do highlights packages, short form packages to exactly fit that particular space and time that the consumer offers. So I'm looking to be able to create some of those as we go forward and deepen this relationship. So that's kind of the journey for us.
And with you, Michael, any specific trends around consumers? Like, you see a certain kind of consumers that come only through these channels, and therefore, let's say the conventional channels on OTT are not able to penetrate.
I mean, we're always kind of, one of the great things about being in the SVOD business as opposed to the old school media business 50 years ago is you get a lot of data. And so we're always looking at what's resonating with customers. We're always sort of experimenting with different media types as we go. Right now, our focus has been mainly on series because we have found while there's a lot of supply of wonderful Indonesian feature films, there's not as much of the type of limited series. And so we're giving content creators who really want to tell stories in a longer format the opportunity to do that.
In a ride, one of the things that we saw is that people typically switch to nonfiction. So they're either watching sketch comedy or something that's snackable, or they're catching up on a highlights package of a nonfiction show, maybe even a sports show. They're typically not looking to get intensely engaged with a crime show or a drama show. So that's kind of one of the high-level learnings, if you will, and these will keep coming out as we expand the experiment.
I think one of the things that we saw and applies to also the airlines industry, where you have the in-plane entertainment. Those screens are now competing with the most popular screen, which is your mobile phone itself, right? So, how do you see that interplay, and do you see any integration between those two screens at some point in time, and how do you see that playing out?
It's an interesting question. I think that one is the form factor itself, right? If you're flying with a much larger screen, then perhaps the comfort of consumption could be very, very different. A lot of airlines in India now will offer movies streamed to your mobile device and just not bother with equipping the screen in the aircraft, or even if it's there, not putting content onto it, because you have so much more variety. One of the things that we see is people, and this is a behavior that perhaps straddles the rest of the world, people in the waiting area before getting onto the aircraft download content onto their phones exactly as much as they know they're going to watch, and that's kind of where I hope my algos can go. But people are doing what algos may in the future.
Yeah. And what do you think, Michael? Like, have you seen any of that happening?
Restate that question for me.
I mean, my question is that when you are basically if the consumer is the same, you have a mobile phone and you have an alternate screen. So while these channels may look like new channels, but if the end consumer is same, you're competing for the attention. So how do you see that playing out?
I think the advantage of mobile is so many more people have mobile devices than necessarily have access to other screens. And you always have your mobile with you. It's almost, for most people now, it's almost like a member of their family. And so for me, like, mobile viewing is going to be more and more dominant. I find that even if I have a big screen television in the other room, I'm watching things on an iPad or watching things on a mobile phone, just because it's more convenient. In terms of the type of content, yeah, I agree. I think if it's a 3-hour, documentary on the history of, ancient Greece, maybe people do not want to sit and watch for that long. But I think for series, where you're actually watching discrete episodes, I don't actually see a difference, really.
And in taking that back to the distribution where we started, you've been trying out various channels. Talk us through the thinking behind, how do you think about channels? Some of these, for example, ride sharing. Nobody thought that could be actually a channel for OTT. So how do you identify a new channel, and what do you think are the key attributes for a channel to be successful?
Sure. I think one where consumers have dispensable time, right? If you don't have disposable time, then you're eating away from something else. So ride sharing, very obvious place to do it, because they're waiting to get from point A to point B. If you take some of our other experiments, like we're doing with e-commerce, I think there we're doing the experiment for a slightly different reason. The hope is that people will watch a show, like a shirt that someone's wearing, and purchase it. Now, the jury's out on how much that's happening. I'm told it's extensive in China. It's not still tipped in India by any stretch. But we want to be there when it happens. And so that's kind of the keeping an eye on where the ball is going to be, as opposed to kind of where it is right now. So that's what we've seen. And the future could be that you went and tried to make a purchase, didn't choose that particular product. Will we show you another show which has the same product? There's a lot of that we're playing with in our heads in terms of how we take that forward.
Any attributes of a good channel? Like, if you were to identify, new channels?
So the one thing about a channel, and why a lot of people resist it, is that you have to recognize that the customer is theirs, right? It's not your customer. Having said that, you're both trying to serve that customer. And so as long as a good channel partner passes back sufficient information for you to be able to create a great experience for that customer, you're in a win-win situation. The minute it becomes a we-they situation where you're just syndicating it, but you're not really involved in the journey of that customer, that's sometimes necessary for a financial decision, but doesn't necessarily deepen the relationship with the customer nor increase engagement and some of those.
This brings me to an interesting conundrum for you, Michael. I mean, you actually have the ecosystem where you actually own the channel, you own the content, and in some ways you own the consumers when it comes to ride sharing. Is it a strength or is it a disadvantage to a certain extent where you have the consumer, but then it also restricts your ability to then give out your content to, let's say, the conventional channels like OTT?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we're doing, I think that's a little different than the way OTTs have been approached before, is we're actually bundling with other Gojek products. So Gojek has, it's a very big ecosystem. It's had 150 million downloads in Southeast Asia. We have 2 million drivers and 500,000 marketplace partners. And what we're doing is we're bundling the GoPlay service in a variety of different ways with other Gojek products. And so people are using Gojek kind of on a day-to-day basis to remove friction from their lives, whether it's transport or food or whatever it is. And by bundling, we kind of enable them to get extra value in the tasks they're doing already, but at the same time get the GoPlay as well. And so, right now our most important partners are the other divisions of Gojek.
Yeah, and sorry.
We were talking off stage, and the thing that struck me is they're very much verticalized in the sense that they have the customer and then they have them at various touch points. And we think of ourselves as content, and so you go content, you go horizontal, and content anywhere. So it's a completely different way of thinking, but it's interesting.
Yeah, and I would love to understand, therefore, how do you two, in very different ways of, distributing that content, monetize this? I don't think it's a mystery to anyone that creating content is very expensive. And in the world where the ability to monetize is getting shorter and shorter, how do you, and competition is there as well, so how do you monetize, and what's your experience around that piece? What models are coming out, and what's your experience, Michael, when you think about both Amazon as well as GoPlay?
Well, monetization, I mean, if you're doing original content, there's multiple ways to monetize. The most immediate way is to get people to subscribe to your SVOD service, and for us, we expect the content to draw people into the Gojek ecosystem, increase engagement, increase lifetime value. If they're using more Gojek services because of the SVOD and engaging more with the ecosystem, it's kind of good for the entire ecosystem as a whole. And then with original content, you can also do offset selling to free-to-air TV. You can sell overseas rights. There's, if you get into certain kinds of content, there's licensing and merchandising, video games. There's a lot of different ways to monetize that way.
Is there any one that is emerging out to be a more popular, a more efficient way of doing it versus the other, or all of them are still in the more evolving stage?
Sure. I think the biggest play outside of premium OTT players like Netflix, etc., is really in advertising, especially in the Indian market, just because consumers are still getting used to the idea of paying for a service online, especially a media service. And so to that extent, AVOD rules the roost right now in India. Having said that, we're seeing an emergence of consumers that are moving very rapidly to the OTT space, and that's giving momentum for more content creation in the OTT space. And so in the next 2 to 3 years, there's going to be a large group of consumers that have now moved lock, stock, and barrel to OTT. And they will be our first clean adopters of paid services, and they'll be first consumers of OTT. So that's still, that journey is probably 2 to 3 years out still. We've got, maybe India's a big country in that sense. So we have already got, the first 10 million, but I think that you need much higher economies of scale to justify all the content costs. The other thing that we do is, and the reason for some of these creative alliances and putting our content out there is that we're always straddling content and brand and monetization. So we think that the more people see our content, the more it pays back us dividends as content owners and the brand VOOT and Viacom 18 in general. So in that sense, the philosophy is very much to straddle both worlds, not to create a closed ecosystem, because we think that the more people see us, the more they'll want to come to our channel.
And this is very interesting. And talk this in light of new alliances now. Like, you know, you have your own app where you have these models that are running well. Now you talk about a completely new channel, like let's say Ola, which is a ride-sharing business. Now, what kind of models work there, and how do you plan to monetize that?
Sure, good point. Right now, Ola is doing it very much for an experience play, right? So the monetization is humble. On VOOT, we have 80 million people already. So in that sense, Ola is going to be well behind. What they're trying to do is Ola is trying to upsell their own customers to have the consumption experience in the vehicle. And so they're trying to monetize it there and are backhanding that to us. So in that sense, it's really not a D2C model. Our role is to get the customer excited about our content, to keep watching it, because that helps Ola monetize their Prime experience better. And as a result, then that we become a downstream provider to them in that. So while we're a D2C player of our own accord, in this, we're sort of helping them with their D2C play, if you will.
Interesting. And Michael, I mean, we are speaking about this. When you think about your stakeholders in the ecosystem, be it the drivers or the merchants or consumers, do you have different subscription models or different monetization models for each one of them? Or is it like just one subscription that anyone can take?
I think another really important stakeholder we have is the content creators in Indonesia. You know, all of the original content we're doing is in Bahasa Indonesia by top Indonesian creators like Wahana Creator with Salman Aristo and Kinan Noir, and we're doing a show right now with Nia Donata, who had done Arasan, with Shanti Harriman and Mira Lismana and Rare Reza, some really wonderful creators. And I think those are some of our most important partners. The way that we're approaching different types of price value is by offering different bundles. And so one of the advantages we have over some systems which maybe have a one-size-fits-all kind of bundle is we can actually target different psychographics at different price points with the bundle and see what works for different parts of our customer base. You know, ultimately we want to delight the customer, and so by giving different options, they can find the option that works best for them.
Interesting. And as we, bridge this gap between how much revenue comes versus the cost of content, and as you think about it, I think the two biggest costs are cost of distribution and cost of creating the content. I know the revenue will go up and we'll be able to monetize more, but where do you see opportunities to lower the cost of distribution or content, and how does this new alliances play into that scheme?
Sure, you're right. I think as content creators, we've been incredibly, in the past, I want to say, very insular about our content, right? We build our content, we like it, and we don't want to share it. One of the earlier presenters in this room was talking about potentially taking web series content to television. And I don't think we've done that enough, right? Once you buy into the philosophy that great content has no boundaries and needs to sort of be seen, then it's just a question of windowing it all over the place. And I think that momentum is coming because, like you mentioned, content is expensive, and at some point you've got to pay the piper. You can't be in investment mode forever. And once you start to realize that, both the eyeballs as well as the monetization comes from spreading it around. Candidly, we haven't even started TV in India, and I don't put it on our own network, and I should.
And what do you think, Michael? I mean, you've seen both the Amazon side and the GoPlay side. Anything interesting happening on creating content a lot more cheaply and cost effectively?
I mean, it's interesting because as you get into original content, right now, as customers have more and more options, many of the traditional providers of licensed content are now starting their own OTTs. And so in many ways, as you look at the advantage of original content to draw in customers and retain them against the increasing cost of licensed content, the original content makes more and more sense. We, at least in the numbers that I've seen in both places, original content is what draws people in and keeps them there. In terms of making content less expensive, it's an interesting question. I think we're looking at a whole broad spectrum of content. Some content is inherently less expensive, But in terms of lowering overall cost, I think that's going to be like an ongoing discussion. Yeah.
I think the one that we're exploring on lowering contest cost is not the master episode, because the master episode, even now, we haven't cracked in terms of how we could use AI to do. But when you want to break down a 1-hour show into its highlights, 10 minutes, 3 minutes, what have you, we're exploring how that can be done through an intelligent machine as opposed to a human trying to cut that down, because then you can really create, for lack of a more exciting term, sweat the asset, because then you can give people what they want without having to employ a lot of staff to do the editing, what have you. So we're exploring that, and that could definitely bring the cost of short-form content down.
Yeah, very interesting. You spoke about AI. We all know data is king. I think a lot of narrative around some of these companies which are not right now in the investment phase is that, at some point in time they have enough scale and data to be able to, monetize it in different ways. And I would love for you guys to talk about how do you see that data being used right now, or let's say 5 years from now. One is obviously you spoke about the content creation piece, but is there anything else that comes to your mind?
So, well, I come from the matchmaking industry where data is even more valuable because it helps you find your life partner. In this case, it's recommending a show to you, which is still valuable. The reality is, in India, for example, when you look at the other OTT players, and not just us, we don't have the depth of data to make deep recommendations. So anybody that's got niche interests pretty much gets generalized by your algorithms because we don't have large enough data. And that's very much a journey for us. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, even the levels that a Netflix has achieved in the West will start to get blown away by what you should see in the morning versus what you should see at night. Video is going to become such an integral part of your life. It should feel like the provider knows you. And we're still a ways away from that. And so that journey is very much just starting.
Michael, how's your experience been? Have you started to, you have a large ecosystem with so many customers. Have you started to use data to really do things which are interesting and unique?
We're always looking at the way to give the best content, serve the best content to each customer. And are doing some really interesting experimentation there that I can't talk about yet. So sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. I think, carrying that logic forward, versus 5 years back, today there are more than a few hundred OTT providers in US and quite a few in emerging markets as well. So it makes it more difficult for consumers to now choose versus the original pay TV days. Now, if data were to become that important, the larger player will have a better network advantage, right? So do you see this industry consolidating at some point in time, if I can say that? Or do you see this changing from 200 partners to few which have larger access to consumers?
I don't see it as much as a network advantage as much as information asymmetry. If you understand the behavior of your consumers better, you can pay the lowest prices in the industry because you know exactly what they want. The reality is right now we're in the process of creating that data. And so some work, some don't work. It's very early days. Going forward, that competitive advantage is what's going to make you either win or lose, because otherwise the providers where you can go to get your content from are largely the same. So your understanding of your consumers is what will differentiate you. And so to that extent, if consolidation helps that premise, absolutely, because you're subscale. But at reasonable levels, like we're at 80 million, that's not bad.
And in Indonesia, Michael, as you have multiple OTT players in Indonesia as well, from the likes of Netflix and Amazon, which may not create very localized content, but as you position your service to the consumers, how do you differentiate your service in consumers' mind so that they can choose you versus, let's say, the other alternate OTTs?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble hearing you because of the reverb.
Okay, no, I'm saying, how do you position your service vis-a-vis other OTT providers in your consumers' mind? As a number of OTT players have increased, right? So it makes it difficult for consumers to choose. What is your proposition to the consumers that they should choose you versus others?
Well, I think we have two advantages there. The first is we're laser focused on Indonesia. And so all of the content we're creating is in Bahasa Indonesia, it's by Indonesian for creators, it's for the Indonesian audience directly. And because of that, it's sort of a unique voice speaking to our customers in a way that's very specific to them. The second thing is we're bundled with the Gojek ecosystem. So most of our customers are using Gojek every day in one form or another. And so as a result of that, it becomes very easy for them to sample. Our customer acquisition cost is low. And once they sample, hopefully they like what they sample and they keep coming back.
Okay, I think one of the last few questions is trying to make you oracle and painting the vision for us in 5 to 10 years from now. As you see this industry evolving, right? How do you think OTT industry will look like in 10 years from now? And also in that, new channels. Like, do you see mobile as being the dominant player and continuing to be direct to consumer as a channel, or do you see multiple channels within OTT as well that will be your way to reach out to the consumers?
Sure. So in India, the mobile is more than 98%, right? I track my numbers, more than 98% of consumption happens on the mobile. It was like that originally in the US, and now I think, as I see it, it's 50-50 between television screens and the mobile. So there will be a balance that will get struck. In India, the big bet is on fiber to the home, right? Which is being pushed by the Jio team. And that will change the consumption experience fundamentally because we're all building for personal viewing at some level. The content is oriented towards individualism as well. But as we start to get more consumption on televisions and other forms of media, we're going to have to start to change the nature of the content that we put out. And so that's sort of how I see our landscape evolving. The timelines are not clear. It's clear that in the next 10 years, fiber to the home will be a reality. I think they're pitching it in the next 3 to 4 years very aggressively. If that were to happen, the industry will transform much sooner. But if it takes its time, then we'll take some time to move forward. Until then, we still have on the mobile, vertical experiences. A lot of that is still unexplored in any great level of detail. So there's a lot to do in the next 10 years to start to make video much more seamless in our lives. Even though it's available now, but it's not seamless. It will be.
And you see the industry being profitable back.
I would hope so. I would certainly hope the industry does become profitable. I do think that broadcasters typically have found a way to be profitable. And the newness of this particular format, long-form storytelling, as well as direct access to consumers, has got content creators very excited to be able to tell more stories. But I do see better sense prevailing. I do see that there's a P&L and a balance sheet to maintain. And so via industry restructuring, a little bit of sobering in terms of the exuberance, I do see us being not just profitable, but very profitable.
Michael, the last words. How do you envision this industry in 5 to 10 years from now?
I mean, what has fascinated me about the media business is the rapid evolution of technology is constantly giving us new ways to tell stories. Storytelling is, eternal. People make sense of their lives through stories. But the type of storytelling that we tell is defined by the tools we have. Older types of storytelling don't go away. People still see theater. They still see feature film, which has been around for 100 years. They still watch broadcast television, which has been around for 50 years. And, you constantly have new types of storytelling, whether it's, completely immersive video games, whether it's AR, VR now coming out. And so it's that evolution that is giving new platforms for storytellers that we always kind of want to be on the forefront of, but ultimately it's how good the stories are that matter.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is all from us. And thank you, Gourav, and thank you, Michael, for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks, Rahul.
Another great session. Please do give a round of applause for Rahul, Michael, and Gourav. Thank you, gentlemen.